Hello, everybody. This is Rob Fredette with the podcast HODGEPOD, and welcome. I have another guest, and it's a repeat guest, Bern Haber. He joined me a few episodes ago. He has published a book of his grandfather, Fritz Haber, who was a German soldier POW in World War II, but the diaries also before that as well. His grandfather, Fritz, was in the German army and has had this book published, or his diary published. And the name of it is Fritz Haber, The Complete Diary, 16 Months in an American POW Camp. And this is just a look back in history. And we're going to go over a few facets. And Bern, welcome back to my podcast. I'm glad you're back. I'm almost done with the diary, but I think this is going to be a good way to look at history back in the 1940s.
Thank you, Rob. Really appreciate having me back. And I'm glad you had a chance to read the book.
Yes, it's a fascinating look back from the other side. I think it's really shows what it was like on the German side. And there's some things there. I'm going to read some excerpts out of the diary as we go along tonight. And when we talked last episode, you had mentioned you had lived in East Germany, and I did a little bit of digging here prior to coming on, but for when you lived in East Germany under Soviet control, just to name a few things, the ideology was all communist Soviet ideology. The state-run media. There was no freedom of press, no freedom of expression, no freedom of religion. So living in East Germany, which was under Soviet control after World War II, what was that like living there? Speak about that again, if you would. And then when you came to the U.S., just the differences, and then we'll get into the diary, because I always find that dynamic between the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union to be like an ending point in the late 80s and 90s with the end of the Soviet Union.
Sure, yeah. Happy to. So just let's go back in history for a moment, for everyone who is listening. So after World War II ended, two German countries came out of it eventually, right? So there was end of World War II, 1945. But then in 1949, two German countries were founded, basically established. One was West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, and then there was East Germany, or the GDR, German Democratic Republic. So when you look at the map at the time, the territory that was occupied by the Allied forces, all four of them. So West Germany was occupied by the French, the British, and the Americans. So they split up the western part. And then Soviet Union, or the Russian army, had occupied the eastern part of it, including Berlin at the time. So in 1949, two countries emerged out of this. As I mentioned, these two countries. And over time, West Germany chose the capitalist way, got integrated into the Western European community or union eventually. Mm-hmm. And then East Germany was part of the Soviet, I say it like this, the Soviet Empire. And we know there's other countries, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and so on. But with East Germany over time, so 1949 and into the 50s, the leaders who came back to East Germany, who survived the war, are also all grown communists. Some were incarcerated in concentration camps, and some spent the final years of the war in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, in other countries, some in Sweden and so on. But they all came back with the desire to build a new society. So communism, socialism based on Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Lenin, some of those theories saying, hey, we can do better than the capitalism. So that was the initial kind of marching order, not just economically, but also ideologically. But over time, the leaders, especially throughout the 60s, and then especially in the 70s, the East and the West German leaders in both sides, regardless of the party affiliation in West Germany, realized this is a special situation. So it's not just Soviet ideology, doctrine all the time. Of course, in school, I had to learn Russian, from grade 5 through 12 for 7 years. So maybe speak a little bit of Russian. Of course, that was part of the education. Of course, the history that was taught, German communist history, Soviet history. However, the GDR in some way was special because of the affiliation with West Germany, because most of the people who lived in both Germanys considered them Germans, right? Going back in history, was a German Empire and then the Weimar Republic. And the desire, at least throughout the 1950s, was to reunite the country, East and West Germany, and all the leaders were trying. Adenauer and on the east side, Walter Ulbricht tried to figure this out. But of course, both sides were kind of encapsulated, if you want to use that term, by the Americans and the Soviets. So they had their own fight or their own agenda, so to speak, what to do with Europe. And one big agenda for the United States, it's almost, a lot of people have forgotten about it. They didn't want never. What was it? Kennedy, John, LBJ, and then Nixon and all the presidents. None of them ever wanted to have another war in the middle of Europe, period. So whatever we can do, of course, with all the conflicts on the discussions and Cuba and all of that, let's keep the trouble out of Europe because we're fighting in Korea, right? Fighting in Vietnam. So I don't want another war somewhere else. Same with the Soviet Union. It sounds a little strange, but they never really wanted another war. Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they tried to, of course, say, well, we're strong and we want to take over the world. Of course, Stalin maybe had the intention, but no one ever wanted a war. And that gave it a special place for East Germany in terms of growing their own society, so to speak, economically, politically, music, all of the above, because of West Germany. So there was a very special dynamic between the two countries. And I can explore a little bit more because my father was in the middle of all of this eventually.
Interesting. When you talk about communism, also, it was a surveillance state. Everybody was looking over their shoulder. I'm sure you heard stories about that living in East Germany, about people looking over their shoulder. Because I remember you had said there was 500,000 Soviet soldiers in East Germany at the time. So I'm sure they were probably at every street corner, or their presence was seen every day.
Not every street corner. So they had their places within the country. So in the countryside, so they had their own spaces where they had all the tanks and the missiles and the soldiers. So, but as part of this, you have to realize East Germany was a small country compared to West Germany or other countries, but they were required to feed 500,000 soldiers. They were required to produce the gasoline for the tanks, for the maneuvers and everything, even though the Soviet Union would deliver the oil or the natural gas, whatever is needed. But the GDR had to feed all the soldiers. So they were not present all the time. If you didn't know where they are, you wouldn't know. But going back to the other point you made, the Secret Service, of course, was all around. You had to be very careful what you say to friends. From that perspective, but you learn quite quickly to navigate these things to make sure, well, you want to not just survive, but you want to just live a normal life.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating because also the school system, like you said earlier, students were studying Marx, Lenin, and socialist theory, and the Russian language was the one that was, you said, spoken rather than English. So absolutely the two dichotomies of communism and democracy. So what was it like when you came to the United States after the Berlin Wall came down? What was it coming to a democracy versus living in those conditions in East Germany?
There was a stage in between. So when the wall came down in November 1989, the two Germanys reunited. Eventually, was the wish for many people over the decades. So I had to adjust to more capitalism coming back, right? From West Germany to East Germany. So I had to adapt and I had to learn how the system works. But it's a funny side note, if you don't mind. So there's this gentleman, Karl Marx, probably know the name, philosopher and economist. He wrote a book in 1883. There's four or five volumes called The Capital. When he at the time analyzed how capitalism works, exploration and so on, exploitation. And we were taught, so this is how capitalism works. So yeah, of course, so wall comes down and then all of a sudden people get fired, lose their jobs. And there's certain things that change dramatically. So that was the first phase for me to adjust, to figure out. I was 26 years old at the time. Okay, young enough. I just had finished college. I was lucky to figure this out. Grew up with this system. That's how it worked and that's how we navigated the system. But here comes a new system. And I had to it took me about 3 years to adjust, to find out the mechanics and how you can make a living in a capitalist world. So that was the first stage. And then in I had a job at the time in a mechanical company for manufacturing, but I could foresee I did not have my own family at the time. And I could foresee that eventually I will be laid off. So they went through stages. Whoever, has a family, you don't get fired right away, but all single people eventually, even, you did your job, was an engineer. So I started to apply for a job somewhere else, and I was hired by an American global IT company. And that brought me over to the United States, to Phoenix, Arizona. And that led me to face another different system in terms of capitalism, which is the United States, which is different, of course.
Oh, very different, very different. I remember in the mid 80s, anything that was portrayed on television or movies or media, it was always America was great. And the Soviet Union was the evil empire, as was stated years ago by President Ronald Reagan. But movies like Top Gun had the proverbial communist country. Then you had trying to think of another movie. The Rocky movie with Ivan Drago. So it was kind of like that old versus West. Even the WWF had the Russian versus Hulk Hogan. So it was a dichotomy of good versus evil, American flag versus the communists. So it was prevalent in pop culture back at that time.
And if it's not about defending one system against the other, of course, every system, and some people may be taken, what's the right word, may be surprised what I'm saying now. Both systems had good things, or have good things. So far, I can give you an example. I went to college in East Germany for 5 years, studied mechanical engineering, and have a master's degree from a very reputable and renowned university in Saxony. Guess how much money I paid for that education?
Zero?
No, I made money. They paid me to go to college. So in the end, I think net, I ended up with, comparably $3,000 over the course of 5 years. Of course, I had to spend some money. So someone paid me to go to college. So it's in principle, whether you can afford it as a country or not. That was one of the things. And there's a few other things. So of course, comparably to the United States, we know what a college education costs.
Yeah. It's expensive. So, that's quite fascinating. I just wanted to delve into that because I always find that time in world history to be very pivotal, like where we are right now. I appreciate you letting us into that world that you were in, because I minored in political science in college at that time. And I was always fascinated by U.S. versus the Soviet Union and in politics and just overall world, affairs. So thank you very much. So we're going to talk about your grandfather's diary, which you published. I'm almost done with it, but it's amazing when I was reading through it, before he was a POW in an American camp, he was talking about his regiment or his team that he had is the anti-aircraft team. And he was thinking his superiors were inept a little bit because there was a disorganization there. And I found that to be interesting.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as we all know, when we join a group of people, whether it's in the corporate world and family or any kind of environment where it's multiple people that you first don't know, you all have pause right there. There is the range of characters, and it's up to you to be able to manage or navigate those characters from, very good friends and real good people to the other side, the extreme, and everything in between. So it was for him the same. And he was, as far as I understand, after talking to him and the writing in his book, he was able to really adjust to various characters, whether, the superiors in his unit who either had no clue what's going on, but they were the officers, but they had to make decisions saying, you go left, you go right. Okay. It's an order. We have to do it. Versus, okay, we got the order, but let's figure out how we circumvent or how we work with this order. You probably read those moments when he had to work with women operating those machines, and the women I can cook, bake a cake, I can make coffee, it's in the household, but I have no idea how to operate this. So to work with the women to make this work, because there was this order. And then the treatment by the officers of the women, where he points in time said, well, slow down, right? So they are just human beings.
Yeah, I kind of liked they thought they were inept or didn't know they were disorganized. So I kind of thought that was kind of interesting that he penned that. So that was quite something. So apparently at the time he gets captured, and I found just the whole getting captured by the Americans and then being POW in the camps. It was quite strenuous and tension. I mean, a lot of tension, very stressful situations. I remember reading there were fights, there were people fighting for a piece of bread. So talk about that if you would, because I found that to be very, very not enlightening, but very interesting that he was able to write a diary while he was as a POW in camp.
Yeah, the one thing he did, and well, sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's serendipity, and sometimes it's the first move. He tried to find people. So once he ended up in the camp, so of course, the American, they captured them, put them on trucks first and trains and put them into kind of gathering places where they, put them all into one place to count them, the names, and did all the, recorded every information, and then shipped them off to the various places in terms of camps. And he was lucky at one moment. I remember his fellow soldier that he served with at the unit, they met again. So they totally met again at this one camp. And they decided to really stick together for each other, right? Save each other's lives if they have to, because there's 20,000, 30,000 people in this camp. So they decided to share the responsibility of, well, you line up today, you get the food, 2 cans of food per person for the day, and the other person would line up to get the water from the faucet. And I remember one of the scenes that he describes this. So he lines up for the water, and all kinds of higher officers cut in lines, and I need to run the officer. And once he gets to the office at the faucet, they ran out of water. So these moments, so that was for him always to have someone to be with and to share the responsibilities. And then also I remember when he describes in the book, when his fellow soldier asked him for a piece of bread or a fork, a knife, saying, hey, I want to cut my bread. And all of a sudden it's gone, right? So that was, he was a good guy, has a good open heart, big heart, say, of course, I'll share my glass, my cup, my knife with you. And then all of a sudden, so these were also lessons that you learn, say, oh, I have to be a little bit more careful because I need to survive in the first place.
Yeah, he was definitely in survival mode. And also I found interesting was that he was always unsure that because they were moving a lot in trucks and trains, and he was unsure where he was going. And then there were times he thought he'd be released. It was disappointment. And it was just quite interesting that he penned that. And then there were times where he didn't pen anything or write anything for weeks. And did you get a sense or ever talk to him about what that was about? Because I'm sure it was probably very tough at times for him to write.
I did not talk to him about it because when I conducted the interview with him in 1990, that was before I had read the diary, but he shared a little bit about it. So I was able to read it at the time. I had to give it back, and then it disappeared for the next 5 years. And then I got a hold of it. And then when I read, of course he has passed away. I could not ask him these questions, but the sense that I got from him was in his mind, first of all, I need to survive, get some food, get some water every day and just survive. But maybe there's hope, and he never gave up that hope. Maybe one day I'm going to see my family again. And there's a great story, not so much in the book, on the website, in the interview, when he tells me how he got from the POW camp in France a letter to an American journalist who goes to Munich to send that letter to a small little village in Bavaria to a certain pastor, and he knew the name, said, hey, can you send that letter to this pastor? And then he sends that letter home to Zwickau, my family, so they know that I'm alive. So that hope one day, and then his first letter, he writes about it, I'm writing this down. Maybe one day my kids will read it. Maybe my wife will read it, but at least it gives him the sense of survival. But over the 16 months, he has doubts. Other people leave, they can go home, not him this time, really frustrated. And then he keeps losing hope, but then comes the next one, or maybe, so then he gets back to writing a little bit. always having that hope. One day I'd go home. So that kept him moving, sometimes weeks in between or even a month. Yeah.
One of the parts of the diary which I found to be, let's see here, all the characteristics of good civic education were unscrupulously thrown overboard. After all, hunger hurts. This lasted for 6 weeks. Every food handed out was quite an ordeal. Orders were yelled, people screamed, and they bickered and hit each other regularly. No one got enough. No one can imagine what problems emerged. When there was leftover food, to share this little bit equally was not an easy task. Sometimes it was handled as follows. So it was just fighting, and it was just always every man for himself. But you said he had paired up with somebody that he had been with. So I'm sure they were able to help each other out.
There's one, I'd say like this, a funny story that he describes when they were put on a truck, the back of a truck. It's an open truck. And there's maybe, I forgot the number, 30 or 40 people really stacked on the back of a truck, an American truck. And they drive quite fast. And they realize they drive down the road. It's not a highway, right? So it's the road, and there's all kinds of trees with branches coming their way all the time. So at least among those 30 or 40 people, they agree, hey guys in the front, tell us when the branch comes our way in that height where the heads are, to tell us, get down, branch goes over, back up. And I think he loses his head during one of those moments. But so at least there's some camaraderie at moments in time. As you just described, the places they were fighting over the last piece of bread.
So this is another one, Christmas 1945. The time just flew by, 8 months in imprisonment. Many of us believe that we'd be home for Christmas, but unfortunately, the fact that this is not the case is not the worst. Worse is that the majority of us do not have any possibility to get in written contact with their families. That is bitter. Even though the imprisonment is not so hard on me, I would still very much like my family to be informed about me so that they would not have to worry about my destiny. Life here is monotonous. So again, describes it in full detail on Christmas 1945. So, and there's another one here. Everything seems normal. This is just me paraphrase. Everything's normal. There's enough to eat. The same with tobacco, clothing, clean and good without difficulties. No one is able to replace the ripped pieces of clothes. Accommodation in bed, but the only thing keeping us is barbed wire. That was the one thing that kept them from freedom, or that's the one thing that they were in that camp. But everything that was like the symbol there, or the item there on the fence.
So yeah, he describes, so once eventually he ends up in this POW camp in Metz in France, the city of Metz. And that's the condition where he's in, just waiting to be released. So food is okay. And every day they pick him up he has to go to work. He is a blacksmith and he's a mechanic. So I think he fixed it. There's one picture in the book, also on the website, where he's shown fixing an American truck. It's some kind of the engine. So of course he was in that sense a valuable labor force. So therefore, maybe that was the reason why they wouldn't let him go, because he's so talented to fix things. Whereas other people who have other jobs or other assignments would let go. I mean, he's wondering, why do they go home and not me? Maybe that's one of the reasons. Unfortunately, I did not have a chance to ask him about what he thought kept him so long in the camp.
Mm-hmm. You said, did he not also do fixing trucks and cars, or he was handy with that? What was it? Blacksmith? Is that the terminology?
So he was a blacksmith by trade. So during the 1920s, his apprenticeship was blacksmithing. So I think it describes it in the book quite in detail, how he first, hit his finger in front of his boss. Was very embarrassing. But he was by trade a blacksmith, but he was also very talented in terms of mechanical work. So yeah, he ended up in a car repair or truck repair shop for the Americans to fix their trucks, whatever was needed.
So you think he got the sense, or I don't know if you ever talked to him about it, but you just mentioned it. Do you think that he was treated differently because he fixed the trucks for the American forces? Because he had that specialty, that specialized way of fixing trucks? You think maybe they treated him a little bit better than maybe most POWs?
It's possible. I would have to speculate. I don't have an exact answer whether he got more food or special treatment. Not among his peers, the soldiers. So there was no special treatment because of that. But the only scene I remember is he was a wrestler. So in the early 1930s, when he joined the communist movement, one place for them to get some strength and fighting power was in sports groups. So he was a wrestler, early 1930s. So therefore, he had this desire to do some exercises in the camp. So he gathers some people saying, hey, can we do something? And they build some device for them, at least to some weights that can, lift the weights and stuff, do some sports to strengthen their bodies. So therefore, it was outside of the regular assignment to fix the trucks. I don't know if it led to special treatment, but at least, again, building community and trust, and of course, eventually also survive through that.
So he was obviously 16 months in a POW camp. What was the sense that you got maybe interviewing him? What was it like to get out of the POW camp?
It was quite a journey when eventually he got to that point when they finally call saying, you go home. And it was quite a journey coming back from Metz all the way to Saxony, that's where his family was. I think it was quite a relief for him to see his family again. My father told me about saying, hey, he was very happy to see his father again. Of course, there were another 5 kids at home and his wife. So big relief. And I remember someone was asking me about the city when he returned home. Name is Zwickau in Saxony. Zwickau is now still, or over the last 100 years, the center of car manufacturing. So you probably know the car Audi, the 4 rings, right? So there was a motorcycle industry in Zwickau, forgot the name, and others. So there was a center of car manufacturing, but not so much military industry. So of course, the industrial pieces were bombed by the Allies and destroyed, but not so much the city. So he was actually lucky returning home into a house that was still standing with the family. And so that was quite a relief. And my dad told me that was a relief to have his father back because they, had to survive with 5 kids and just the wife.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the book when you put it together, this book of the diary. How did you come about with the idea to do it, and how was it received? Obviously it's published. How has it been received after it's been published? Because it's really a big look into at that time in history.
Yeah. So the first time I came about this diary was in 1990, as I mentioned earlier, when I interviewed my grandfather. I traveled to Zwickau. I said, tell me everything you know about my dad. At the time, I was so interested to learn about my dad, his life, and all the cool, secret stuff, family history. And during this interview, it's about 3 hours of recorded interview. During the interview, he said, oh, Bern, did you know that I have this diary? I wrote this diary about my experience. Oh, wow, I would love to read it. So he permitted me to read it. I took it to Berlin, had it for a few weeks. I took some notes and quotes, but I had to give it back. So then he had it until he passed away, and then it disappeared in someone's box. And in 2020, when I visited my father in Berlin, he was 89 at the time, and he had just a few more months to live. I spent a whole week with him, which is actually a great thing when someone is passing on very soon. Spent the whole week with him and his wife to talk about history, all his life and episodes. And he turns around and says, oh, Bern, here's the diary of my father. Do you want it? Hello. Yes, of course. Because I knew about it, but I had no idea where it is. And so I took it home with me to Phoenix, and then I, of course, read it because it's beautifully written, German. And you've read it, Rob, right? So when you read it, you can close your eyes. You're in the sea, right? Whatever it is, with the kitchen flooding or whatever he describes. It's so visually, beautifully written. So I read it and said, what should I do with this? I mean, of my own family history, it's great. Why not publish it? And I thought of maybe I should publish it in Germany because it's a German book. It's written in German. Maybe it's the easier way. But then I decided to actually publish it here in the United States. So I had it professionally translated by someone who teaches English at the university. It took a few months, of course. And then the reason why I wanted to publish it here in the United States is to present it to an American audience. As we all know, a lot of Americans who are interested in history or at least know about World War II, reference points, Holocaust, Nuremberg tribunal trials, D-Day maybe, and a few other things. The biggest battles of tanks and references. A lot of people know about World War II, but just to that extent, and have seen some documentaries or movies and have a sense of. But that personal story of someone who lived through this as a communist, had to serve in the Wehrmacht, all of that. So I thought it might be an interesting project. So it took me 4 years to get it ready. And most of the time I spent finding a publisher, as we all know, right? So you write a hit song, but you need a record company to make it. You write a best-selling book, but you need to find a publisher. Of course, I could have self-published it. That's easy to put it out and then hopefully someone discovered it. But I was very lucky to find a publishing house here in Arizona, in Mesa, who were very interested in the project. They helped work with me on it. So now I have this published book. I own all the rights. It's in the Library of Congress, registered, which is a great thing. It took a while because they came back and said, well, you didn't write the diary, right? No, it was your grandpa. Correct. So you don't own the rights. So your grandpa owns the rights, but he's dead. So what should we do? So I had to there's a certain way of registering a work like this. So it is all now in the Library of Congress. And the feedback that I have gotten so far is tremendous, mostly from American readers, friends, families, and people who never came across a book like this. And it always comes down to this personal perseverance of someone who gets just thrown into a situation. You cannot say no, and you have to deal with this, whether it's a bad thing or a good thing. So they're all enthralled by the perseverance, but at the same time, by the personality of my grandfather to make it work, whether he's an apprentice, he serves a few years in a concentration camp or in a prison, and then ends up in serving in the Wehrmacht and then also in the POW camp. So yeah, a lot of people, if someone is interested, I would love to point them to the website. There's a lot of reviews there from Amazon, very personalized perspectives on how much people like the book because of that.
I think it's important to read about both sides, because this is it's chronicle from before when he was part of the anti-aircraft, and then also through World War II when he was a POW. I think it's good to see both sides of history. I think it's very important to read about history because everybody, I think we talked on the last episode there, everybody, we're all humans and everybody has families. And like you said, he was forced to go into this and he really couldn't say no. And he was able to persevere through the POW camp. I find that I'm glad that there is a great response to it, because we all need to read history, no matter on either side. It's 80 years since World War II, but I think it's like you said, when I'm reading the diary or you read any nonfiction, it's like you're in the room or you're actually there in the book. The person comes alive in the writing.
Mm-hmm. If I may mention, there's one more important piece of the book, which is the foreword. Well, you've read it, I'm sure. It's written by Björn Krondorfer. He's the director of the Martin Springer Institute here at the Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. And he, for me, was also a mentor. So I met him early 2020, actually, because he did present his own father's story, who was also a Wehrmacht soldier and a guard near concentration camp, not at the camp, but near. So his father knew exactly what was going on. And for years, his father would never talk about it. Said, I don't want to talk about it. Don't ask me any questions. But eventually in the 90s, I believe, he convinced his dad, let's do this. Let's travel to the place where you serve, got the place, and you tell me everything you want to tell me. So he recorded his father's story and then turned it into a book. So I met Björn at this event when he presented his book and asked him, I told him about my grandfather's diary. He said, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, let's talk. And long story short, he ended up writing the foreword. And the reason why I'm very honored and proud of this foreword is because he also teaches history, Holocaust history at the Institute. And he looks at the story from multiple perspectives. Of course, the personal experience of my grandfather, but he goes back also after World War II, the generational conflict of Germans to deal with the guilt of what happened during World War II or the 12 years of fascism, where the first generation, like in his case, did not get anything out of their parents or grandparents. Either they did something good, but there was so horrible experience, was part of the resistance, but I don't want to talk about it. Or they were part of the other side and did some horrible things and said, I don't want to talk about it. So the first generation after World War II, those parents, grandparents, they didn't get much out of their parents. So then comes to the next generation. So that would be my father. So I don't know if my father ever talked with his father about his war experience. I doubt it. I don't recall any reference to that. So then comes the next generation, which is me. Now with that distance or certain distance to what happened, now being able to open up someone's mind. So and I was very lucky compared probably to many people who even as a second or third generation reaching out to their parents and grandparents and still not get anything out of it. I was very lucky. My grandfather said, ask me any question during this interview. He gave me the diary and I talked to my father about his perspectives. So I have actually the diary of Fritz's mother, which is my great grandmother. I have that diary as well, which adds some pieces to the puzzle. So I'm very lucky to have all these pieces I could put forward with the publication. But this forward, I would emphasize if someone wants to read the stories in the diary, it's great. But this forward really puts a historical perspective on all of this.
That's unbelievable. It's great that you had a mentor, somebody who was able to help you with the process. Was there, going back to the Cold War, was there a place that you would have to cross over to Germany, East Germany, West Germany? Was it a place, was it called Checkpoint Charlie?
I never crossed the Checkpoint Charlie, but there's a interesting story with it. I have to go back into history with 1 year, which year it was. I'm a music buff. So I grew up with, of course, music in East Germany, but of course was fan of other famous bands like the Rolling Stones, for example. So there's this 1960, forgot the year, 80 or maybe 70s. They played on the West German side on this publisher building on the rooftop, like the Beatles when they played their last concert. And the Rolling Stones performed a concert on top of that building, which was near the wall.
Wow.
Smaller. So, of course, I was not there at that time, but there was the opportunity to be near the border, but not near enough to get shot, right? But near enough to hear the music of the Rolling Stones. I never had the chance to cross Checkpoint Charlie until, of course, the wall came down. And then I, of course, checked it out and said, that's that easy to cross.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles too, so I can see why people were excited about that. And that was and they've been together, 62 years? That's just blows my mind nonetheless.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been quite something to hear the Rolling Stones on the East German side if they were on top of the building there. Maybe they were sending a political statement at that time.
And there were many concerts like, the Brandenburg Gate, and there was, of course, the wall, and there was the Reichstag, the building, and in front of, which is the government's building today, but in front of the Reichstag is a huge place, open air space, and they organized so many concerts there. Turn up the volume quite a bit. Pink Floyd. You just had to figure out that Pink Floyd is playing Friday night over there. We would hang out near this area, say, oh yeah, I can hear the walls, something.
Wow. That's crazy. And I remember you said that when everybody got like a per diem, when the wall came down, the first thing you did was you bought vinyl records. Do you remember what vinyl records you bought?
I only remember one artist, probably nobody knows. It's a Dutch artist called Herman van Veen, Veen, Herman van Veen. I was, and I'm still a big fan of his. He performed several times in East Berlin before the wall came down. So I had seen him live perform. So of course I went to that record store, bought at least one or two of his albums. I do not know which other albums I bought at the time.
Wow.
Sorry.
That's unbelievable. The music and sports always transcend political conflict. Just the fact that you just said the Stones, Pink Floyd played. That's quite fascinating. They played in the rooftop. I didn't know that. That's a fascinating story.
Now I was about to mention, so after War Came Down, 1990, or again, I have to look it up, early 90s, the Rolling Stones came to East Berlin, 1991 or 1992, right after the war came down, played a concert at this open space, and I was maybe 10 meters from the stage.
Oh.
The Rolling Stones, just right there. Tina Turner came, Bruce Springsteen, all those years. Within 2 years, they brought them all in. It was just phenomenal. Finally.
Yeah, that's great. So you were able to hear those groups, though, when you were, I mean, you could hear them on the radio, or could you not?
Yes. So of course, the most famous bands, we pick them in the 70s, 80s, they would play on the radio at certain times of the week. And of course, if you were able to tune into like the American radio station in West Berlin, I forgot the name, so you could listen to other music that you would not hear East German radio or West German radio stations. Yes. But you had to be careful. Some people would maybe snitch on you saying, hey, like during World War II, you're listening to the BBC. Not that you got shot, but, could lead to trouble.
Wow. That's just to listen to a radio music, people would snitch on you? Man, oh man.
Some, not all of them. So I don't want to generalize.
Crazy. Man, oh man. That's wild. The book that Bern Haber has published, it's from his grandfather, Fritz Haber, The Complete Diary, 16 Months in an American POW Camp. I'm almost done with it, and I find it really fascinating when you read it. There's some times where you don't have any, where you go without weeks without writing, and then all of a sudden you see more writing and the travels of going from camp to camp, the struggles, the stress, and it's quite remarkable to read this piece of history right here. So, do you have anything else to add, Bern, that we haven't covered? Maybe that you want to cover?
Yeah, I would like to add 2 pieces for everyone who listens. I want to share the address of the website.
Yes, please do.
So it's www.16, the number 16, 16, months, as POW, all one word, .com. www.16months@pow.com. Much more information there on the website about the book, the project. And the second final reference I would like to make, if anyone is out there listening to this and thinks this whole story makes a great movie or a series of episodes, like a kind of Netflix series, I would be very interested to turn this into a movie project. I've reached out already to some people in the industry in Germany. Here, so far, I haven't gotten too far, because my pitch is actually whoever plays my grandfather in the leading role will win the Oscar.
Well, I'll tell you what, this diary here is going to definitely help with that. That's great. And also the Library of Congress, it's in the Library of Congress, you said. I went to the University of Maryland in the mid-'80s, and I used to go to the Library of Congress and go do a lot of research for some of my papers and some of my classes. That was quite a place. I spent hours and hours there. I take the train to D.C. and go to the Library of Congress. So it was quite a place. So Bern Haber has been my guest, and I really thank you very much, Bern, for coming back on to talk about this more in depth. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This is an important story to tell.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate for the opportunity to present the story of my grandfather. In the first episode, we talked, and today diving into more details about it. Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.